Would you please welcome Paul Reddick and band?
Echo in the gloaming, a quiver in the breeze. She moves like a river. Won't you tell me, please? A song in the silence, a leaf upon the tree. She moves like a river. Won't you tell me, please? Now you see me more. Now you love. Well, I'll be flying like a morning dove, like a morning dove. A voice in the distance, a quiver in the stream. Oh, she moves like a river. Baby, tell me please. A song in the silence, a leaf upon the tree. Ooh, she moves like a river. Tell me please. Now you see me, and now you love. Well, I've been flying like a morning dove, like a morning dove, like a morning dove. A quiver in the stream. She moves like a river. Won't you tell me please? A voice in the distance, a leaf upon the tree. Ooh, she moves like a river. Tell me please, just how you see me walk. And now you love. Well, I'll be flying like a morning dove, like a morning dove, like a morning dove, like a It's great to be in this awesome, cool spot. And thank you for coming down.
After our interview with Holger here, we're going to have MonkeyJunk on the stage. And in case you didn't know, Stony Plain Records and Record Setter Records bring you a new MonkeyJunk album called Time to Roll. Just released today. It's there on the wall. pick up your copy, and the guys will be happy to sign it for you today as well. All right, and now to introduce a man who needs no introduction, but heck, I'm going to do it anyway. Holger Petersen has served as the amiable host of CBC Radio's Saturday Night Blues for some 30 years, and the host of CKUA Radio's National Blues since the days when dinosaurs. Tell me that if you've just published Talking Music 2, there must have been a Talking Music 1. You can't get anything past me. Walk us a bit through the genesis of that first volume and how you got into the publishing game from radio.
Well, Talking Music 1 came out 5 years ago, and I had an opportunity. I was approached to do a book and just do a book, period, whatever, kind of was interesting. And I thought, well, this is an amazing opportunity. And through various stages of pursuing how to do this, it came down to just realizing that the best way to do it would be to transcribe some of the interviews with amazing artists that I've worked with. And as I got more into the process, I thought, well, for me, it started with the British invasion bands, and that led me through to Memphis and the Delta and Stony Plain Records, and working with some legendary artists. So I thought, well, that's a nice flow to have that. And of course, it didn't start in England without some sparks. And one of those was a guy called Chris Barber, Chris Barber played an incredible role. He's still alive, he still plays, but he was the guy that first brought Muddy Waters and Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee and Louis Jordan, so many different people to Britain, and had so much to do with presenting that kind of music to the young up-and-coming Rolling Stones and Eric Claptons of the world. So he was the first interview in the book, followed by, I think, about 5 British invasion person interviews. Mick Fleetwood, Bill Wyman, of course, from the Stones, Eric Burden, Long John Baldry, huge friend to Canada's. And they talked about those early days in the late 50s and 60s, introducing blues. And then from there, it kind of goes right back to an interview I was very fortunate enough to do with Alan Lomax, who was going down to the Mississippi Delta back in the 1930s. And he gave me this amazing interview talking about what he saw and witnessed and recorded as part of, him and his father recorded Leadbelly first and so many other legendary people, Son House. So that it kind of goes through that evolution, which was my education and so many people's education in terms of discovering the blues. And the more you discover, the further you get into it, kind of thing. So that was book 1.
So when it came time to do a volume 2, what did you learn from the first time around? How did you think differently? How did you sort of decide to formulate a second volume?
Yeah, I gave it 5 years because I you need some time off, and I do other things, and so it took about 2 years of work to do it, and again coming up with kind of a format for it. And in this case, it's Blues and Roots Music Mavericks, because there's 25 people in the book. And I think they're all very individual. They all have great stories to tell about what they've done. And it was just a matter of going through, and over the years I've had some wonderful opportunities to interview so many great people, and I'm just kind of going through and saying, yeah, that was good, that was wonderful, and going back and re-listening to things, and then kind of finding a bit of a flow to it.
How do you get the flow? Do you sort of try to group things thematically, chronologically? How do you decide what to leave in, what to leave out?
Well, it's kind of random, but there is actually, to my mind, there is a bit of a flow. The very first interview in the book is with B.B. King, who I just had the honor of interviewing maybe 6 or 7 times from the 70s through to the last interview I did with him, which is the one primarily in the book. There's other bits of interviews from the previous years, but that was done when he was 80 years old, and it was on his tour bus. And it was just a wonderful experience. He gave me a lot of time, a on a few occasions with BB, after the interview, I actually had a chance to kind of hang out with him and, do things with him. He was very, very hospitable. But that interview was really touching for me, and he had died, of course, not long before I was working on the book, so that made sense. And then I followed that up with Alan Toussaint, another person who just passed away, and who was so generous with his time, another giant who was involved in so much amazing music, and loved to talk about his friends, who were, Lee Dorsey and Irma Thomas and Dr. John and really Professor Longhair. The history of New Orleans music was very well articulated by, I think, Alan Toussaint in that interview. So each interview has a story about it. Each one is, I think, a maverick and somebody who had an individual style with what they did, whether it's Van Dyke Parks or Mose Allison or Dan Hicks and the Hot Licks, and of course all the great blues people.
A lot of the artists have passed away, of course, since you've done the interviews, and will sadly continue to do so. But when that happens, does that add a certain level of additional poignancy or focus to the interviews for you?
It does. It makes me realize that when I do have an opportunity to do an interview, I really should try and be as prepared as possible to get as much information, because you just never know how long all this stuff is going to go on. And I think that there's nothing like first-person recollection as a writer or reviewer or whatever you do, an interpreter of music, to be able to go to the source and hear the oral history directly from the people involved is an incredible opportunity, and one that I think I take pretty seriously when that opportunity does come around.
A favorite of mine in the new collection was the Townes Van Zandt interview. He's someone I've always been fascinated with, and it's also the most vintage interview in the book. It goes back to '86, I believe.
'86, yeah.
How did that come about? And tell me a bit about Townes.
Well, I was fortunate to get to know Townes. Stony Plain distributed some of his records, but even prior to that, I was a fan of his early poppy releases. And he was one of those people, the first time you met him, he was just so friendly and easy to hang out with. He'd tell jokes, and when he was in a good mood, there was just nobody better to be around. It was just a great experience. And I had met him in '82 at the Vancouver Folk Festival and did an interview with him, and then met him again in 1986 when he came to Edmonton to do Ian Tyson's TV show. And we ended up hanging out for several days, and one of those days I picked him up at the hotel shortly after he arrived, and we went to CKUA and sat down and did this very long interview, which is kind of a conversation. It was just more of a conversation in a sense, just because it flows so freely with him telling jokes, and I was looking back, so honored to hang out with Townes and Guy Clark together. I brought them to the Edmonton Folk Festival, I think 4 years in a row together, because I just thought they were about as good as it gets at what they did. And then we hung out in various places, different festivals, and even in places like Germany and France, and the odd time be in various places like that. And so I was, it was very, very moving to go back and hear some of those things.
So a few years back, I used to do an interview series online that I called the Facebook Music Interviews, where people had artists on live that were text chatting. So they had to type their answers live, and people would watch and also add questions and stuff. And I found that because they were focused on typing their answers, it sort of brought down their defenses and sort of opened them to some really honest and interesting answers. What are some of the tricks that you've learned over the years and that you bring into your interview style that sort of works to draw stuff out of artists that might otherwise be reticent?
Well, I think the first thing I do is really be well prepared, and that's just one of my favorite parts of the whole process is if I'm going to interview somebody, I really like to listen to the music. I read as much as I can about them, wherever I can get the information. Because I think by being prepared, you're ready for the interview wherever direction it's going to go. And you've got, your follow-up answers and questions in certain, areas where you're talking to them. And it's also nice if they're saying, yeah, that was done in a studio in 1972, and I can't remember the bass player's name, and then you're there with the bass player's name, and that kind of research, I think, really helps the flow of it, and also the comfort level.
You have to establish a certain level of trust.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So they have to know that they sort of get the sense pretty immediately in the interview if you know what you're talking about and
Yes.
you've done your homework.
Yeah. I used to really concentrate a lot on what the first questions would be. I still do that, but the reality of a lot of these interviews with people who are well known is that you're going to get them perhaps when they have a new record out or a new something to promote. And they'll be available at that point. So I think the first thing to do is get that out of the way and just, like Booker T is on the road, for example, doing an R&B show with a whole bunch of, guests and, material from his career. So you want to talk about that and get that out of the way, and that's the message that he wants to get out to the people. So that's a great place to start.
It's amazing how many interviewers don't pick up on that. They save the film that or the book they're talking about, or the music they're talking about to the end, almost like it's an afterthought, right? They want to go through the history first and finish with that. Yeah. But then the artist starts getting uneasy that they're not going to get to talk about what they're really there for. So when you get that out of the way right off the bat, it really does then settle the rest of the interview.
And I think once you start and you get them to talk about that part of it, that really opens the door for so many other questions about their history, that they might reflect on or just touch base on, So then you've got license to kind of go in those areas.
Yeah. So I'm sure all your interviews you consider more or less your children, and it must be hard to pick between them. But if I was to ask you in this current collection to pinpoint one in particular that you feel was for some reason your favorite, or that really kind of, you felt you nailed it and it's sort of definitive, could you do that?
That would be very difficult. I think, the one I was very, very satisfied. I'm very happy with all those interviews. And Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs drove around in a hearse. They had a converted hearse, as he says, BVs, before vans, right? So they had this hearse and they drive through these towns, and they put the lights on, and one of the guys in the band would put a top hat on and a flat coat, and they cruise through these towns, and all their equipment was in the back. And he tells this really lengthy story about they had this suicide door on this hearse, and he was going down Highway 61 just outside of Clarksdale, and half asleep. He thought the door was not quite closed, so he opened up a little bit, and the door opened, and then next thing you know, he's hanging on the door, scraping along the highway. Anyway, just stuff like that. It's rock and roll.
So out of the interviews, which would you say provided you the greatest moment of surprise, where something totally unexpected was revealed, or where, wow, I had no idea, mind blown?
Well, actually, that happens a lot, but the one that comes to mind is the B.B. King interview, the first one in the book, where I got on his tour bus, and it was exactly an hour before showtime, and B.B. was sitting in front of 2 computer screens, and so I asked him, I said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm going through my MP3s, and he starts describing his record collection on his computer, and he's got 46, Kenny Burrell, and going through all the guitar players who he loves, and X number of Django Reinhardt, and he's in a matter of just a few minutes, you get such incredible insight into what B.B. loves, and the fact that he put every one of those tracks on there individually. He didn't put albums on, and he made a point of saying, and I downloaded them, they're all paid for. None of this, So, in a very short period of time at the beginning of the book, you get a really great sense of what B.B. loves to listen to, And then he says, and there's like 486 B.B. King songs. He said, but I don't. He said, the only reason I have them on, he said, I need to remind myself every once in a while. So when I go out on stage, I still remember the song. So that was really nice, and that experience was fantastic because B.B. had exactly an hour when I got on the bus before the show started. So we did this long interview, and then he's saying, "Oh, have you heard this?" He said, and then he starts playing me songs off of the computer, right? And meanwhile, his guy is going like, So then he apologizes, and he said, "Well, listen, let's do this some more, but I got to go to work right now." And so we say our goodbyes, and I go back to the front of the Jubilee Auditorium, go take my seat, and just in time to see B.B. walking on stage. It's just like, wow, I just spent an hour with him, and there he is again, That was great.
All right, here's one more angle. Which interview provided you with the greatest challenge? Where it's really tough to get the information out. The walls are up, the defenses are up. You're having to probe to find your openings, and it's just seems to be a struggle to get to the goal of the interview.
Yeah, a lot of people, of course, are reluctant. They may be kind of feeling obliged to do interviews from time to time to help promote something. One that's not in the book that does come to mind is Boz Scaggs. And it turned out to be a really great interview. He had some reservations, and just sometimes, certain things happen. I asked him, I said, well, there was a great 70s horn band that he had, and the records that he made at the time, it was a different kind of sound that he had. And I said, was there a blueprint that you saw for that particular sound? And you kind of expect people to say, Bobby Blue Bland or B.B. King or something like that. And he said, Doug Somm. He said, Doug Somm was in the Bay Area, and he had this great horn band. And it was just like, wow, Doug was a dear friend of mine. Like, he lived with me. He came to Canada for 2 years, And so all of a sudden, it's like, Doug Somm? And so that whole door opened, and it was just great. So we didn't spend a lot of time on that part of it. We went on with the interview, and he was very generous. But then after the interview, it was all, well, let's talk about Doug, because he was a dear man.
So that's the trick again. You've got to find that point of commonality
if it's there,
where you can relate to.
Sure, yeah, if you're lucky enough to find it.
Yeah, and earn that trust.
Yeah.
To open up. So, like the music industry, the publishing industry has gone through a lot of evolution and challenges over the years, and uncertainty. So, are you finding that there is still a market for these things made from trees and hardcover? And are the books also available electronically? Yes.
Yeah, they are. They're available electronically. I'm fortunate enough to have them available around the world too. And being here today, I can't tell you, this is so great, to be amongst music lovers in a store like this. Thank you, John, for this opportunity. Because we are all amongst friends, we're all members of this tribe or whatever we are, there's people like us all over the world, and it's great when we can get together. So yeah, if you can find that, and I think music brings us all together for sure.
The song that we're going to play right here, we co-wrote with Paul, and it's called "See the Sign." 1, 2, 3, 4. I can feel it in the talking, when I saw what I heard. I can feel it in the promise, when they're not a word. But I can feel it in the people, when the bar and wine. I can feel it in the world, when the change is tide. When they start coming, where it's supposed to be. I can feel it in the tears when the news is in. I can feel it in the travel and the way we've been. I can feel it in the other when the all is true. I can feel it in my heart when I meet you. I'm dreaming, dreaming, when it's crystalline. I'm screaming, screaming, can you see the sign? Can you feel the love? Can you feel the love? Can you see the sign? Thank you very much.